Okay, hi seniors. Today we're going to do our last lesson in our little unit on modern issues in journalism. I'm going to talk about the whitewashing of the news as well as the lack of freedom of the press in many international countries besides the United States. So we'll start with whitewashing. Whitewashing can mean two different things. It can refer to like the glossing over of major issues, shoving scandals under the rug, stuff like that. That has a lot more to do with the need for like investigative journalism and with bias in the news and stuff like that we've sort of already addressed. But that's one definition of the term whitewashing. The other definition has to do with the dominance of white individuals in the field of news journalism. There's little to no diverse representation when it comes to women, when it comes to people who identify as being part of other minority groups, that kind of thing. So that's what this whitewashing refers to. It's just the dominance of white reporters or white males who work in this field. So gender and ethnic diversity in newsrooms hasn't really improved in the last decade. It kind of was on a steady incline before then, but for the past 10 to 15 years or so, it's just sort of steadied off, and there hasn't been any more increase in diversity in the newsroom, despite the fact that the demand for news, the demand for more diverse news, the demand for 24-hour news has increased. So even though there's a demand for more diverse news, there's this demand for different kinds of news. The people who should be providing that kind of news are not working in news journalism. So that's one of the huge issues that modern journalists today face and that consumers of the media face, is that we're not getting information from minorities, from women, people like that who should be represented in a field that serves to provide information to all. So this has more to do with the fact that there's just like not a lot of representation in news media right now. And when there is a lack of representation, the news that you're getting isn't catered to the audience that needs to be catered to when you're talking about specific things. People don't know the context of a lot of these issues. They've never personally experienced it. They don't understand firsthand how it can impact people. You know, whether you're talking about growing up as a woman and maybe not being able to receive like equal treatment to men, or maybe you're writing about females running for president. It's going to come differently from a female voice and reach a female audience differently than it's coming from a male voice, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. The same goes for some of the issues that we've already talked about with the hate you give when it comes to like a black audience. If you are coming from that background and you're able to speak about it with more honesty and with actual like evidence, firsthand account, then that is going to be better received than someone who's white and who's coming in and wants to write about these issues, if that makes sense. So diversity in a field, not only is that important just to help create more equality and equity in the United States, it's also important to help make sure that the media is representing people well, is getting information out to the audiences that it needs to get information out to, not just one audience, but all audiences, and that it has the staffing to do that. So that's kind of what whitewashing has to do with. So a couple statistics from 2016 and 2017 studies. Nationally, Hispanic, Black, and Asian women make up less than 5% of newsroom personnel at both online and traditional print publications. So obviously 5% is a really dismal number. And when you have that small amount, obviously the audience that equates to isn't getting the information and isn't being represented the way that they need to be by news media. Similarly, in the 2017 study, 433 news organizations were interviewed, and from all those organizations, they found that in total, only 17% of print and online employees identify as being part of a minority group, despite the fact that nearly 40% of Americans are part of a minority group. So this has to do with representation. People from these minority groups are just simply not being represented in news media, so their voices are not being heard, their opinions aren't getting out there, their perspective on certain issues isn't being addressed in newsprint media, which is the main way that Americans get their information. So that's kind of obviously an issue. Continuing on with that, going back to issues in gender, 37.7% of news was created by female journalists, according to an analysis of over 24,000 pieces of news. Obviously, 37.7% is better than 5%, but it's still less than 50%, which if we have accurate and equitable representation, it would be 50%. And then I really liked this quote from the NPR article that I cited in the slideshow, so I'm going to read it aloud to you. The norms of journalism and the routines of news organizations are deeply ingrained. Expecting a handful or often less of non-white employees to improve news coverage places a lot of pressure on them, when it likely requires a larger commitment from the entire newsroom or organization. If we hope to see more widespread change, the commitment needs to be a lot deeper than diversity hiring. So basically what that means is just that if you want to increase diversity and representation in news media, it has to happen by more than just hiring people from different backgrounds. You have to broaden your horizons in terms of the stories you're going to talk about and the audiences you hope to reach. So you can't just hire someone who's from a minority background and then tell them to keep reporting on the same news that you're already reporting on. One of the benefits that has to come with hiring a reporter from a different background is that they can bring in a voice and an opinion to represent issues that maybe you aren't already talking about. So that's whitewashing of the news in general, how it exists in the U.S. today, kind of ways that it can be addressed based on these 2016, 2017 studies and interviews. So that's just a little bit of information about that. And then the last one we're going to talk about today is the lack of international freedom of the press. So the United States does have freedom of the press. That's one of the amendments that we benefit from for sure. However, there are many, many countries in the entire world that do not have freedom of the press. So there's 57 total countries that lack complete and total freedom of the press, and that is anything from just like slight restrictions or gagging to like complete and total the government runs the press. So it varies a lot, but the 10 countries that face the highest, I'm trying to figure out the best way to word this. The 10 countries that face the most oppression, I guess, when it comes to being in the news are North Korea, Eritrea, China, Vietnam, Sudan, Syria, Djibouti, Saudi Arabia, Laos, Iran, and Cuba. So those countries have really high restrictions when it comes to news media, and they are very, very limited in what they are allowed to print. And a lot of it has to do with government suppression and control, where these countries aren't free anyway. They don't have freedom, any kind of rights within their people. And so especially this is seen through the censorship that's placed on news media. So people can't voice their opinions. They can't talk about like modern social issues, anything like that could make the government look bad, or that could demonstrate a little bit more like free thinking, because the way that these countries are run is very heavily reliant on government suppression. And that's how the government kind of controls these countries. They also control newsprint media. So the news is very, very restricted, very censored, kind of only gets out basic information. And that's obviously a problem because when you censor people, when you don't have freedom of the press, then the people do not get accurate representation. They don't get to express their opinions, their voices aren't heard, and they get further suppressed through really suppressive laws and government that doesn't really represent them well and different issues like that. So freedom of the press is really necessary to just make sure that the people of the country feel heard, their voice is getting out there, the issues that they care about are being covered. News media has more to do than just reporting on what's going on. There's opinion sections, there's editorials, there's the opportunity for people to express social issues that they notice, to talk about political issues, stuff like that. That doesn't get to happen in these countries. So that's why lack of international freedom of the press is obviously a huge deal. It's a really big problem that doesn't really get a lot of attention because it's not something that is easily solvable. Obviously, the entire way that these countries run has to be uprooted and dismantled before we can have freedom of the press in these countries. But it's important that we know that these countries are being suppressed so that we can just better sympathize and understand with what's going on in these countries. It's just, the more informed you are, the better you are at helping solve the problem and address the issue. So some of the ways that these countries face censorship is government-controlled press, lack of access to news. Maybe it's really, really expensive. People don't have access to technology, stuff like that, where they're not able to read the information, feel informed and educated on, social issues that are going on in their country. Heavy censorship, which would just mean articles have to be read through, and a lot of information needs to be taken out if it's in any way like degrading toward the government or expresses like personal opinion, anything like that we get to enjoy the right to do in the United States, they don't have the right to do in these countries. And then investigative journalism is completely gagged, so people aren't able to research issues like scandals and crime and government interference more in depth. So there's no one to keep the government in check. There's no one to keep higher authority officials in check because they're so gagged when it comes to investigative journalism rights. And so a lot of people who are in authority in these countries kind of run rampant because no one is able to hold them accountable basically for their actions. They could actually even go to jail. A lot of journalists face jail time in these countries depending on what they publish and how much they investigate an issue. So that's just a little bit about lack of freedom of the press internationally. It is a huge issue that a lot of reporters face when they are from other countries, and even American reporters and reporters from like free countries are not able to go in and report on issues that are happening. So a lot of the rest of the world is kind of in the dark about what's happening in these countries, and that's obviously never a good thing. So yeah, that's just a little bit about the lack of international freedom of the press, why it's an issue, how it kind of confounds and leads to bigger issues like government control, stuff like that. So those are the two issues that I wanted to talk about today. Those are the final two issues that we're going to talk about in terms of modern issues in journalism. As always, I listed links below in the slideshow in case you want to do more research on these issues if there's something that really interests you. And if you have more questions, you can talk to me about them. As usual, this is just a really broad overview of these topics. There's a lot more in depth that you could go with it if that's what you're choosing to do for your issues that you're researching, whether it's for the assignments or the paper. So yeah, that's just kind of a wrap up of this unit. I hope you have a great Wednesday and a happy Easter break, and I will check in with you guys again on Tuesday the 14th. So, bye.